مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. تغيرت الدبلوماسية تغييرا هائلا خلال المسيرة المخنية المدهشة لويليام بيرنز نائب وزير الخارجية الأسبق. من ناحية اختفت صورة وسائل النقل والاتصالات تحولا في الدور الذي يلعبه الدبلوماسيون، ومن ناحية أخرى المسؤوليات التي يتولاها الدبلوماسيون الآن متمثلة في تعزيز الديمقراطية والصحة والتنمية وحقوق الإنسان تختلف بدورها اختلافا كبيرا عن الاهتمامات الاستراتيجية المحدودة التي ركز عليها الدبلوماسيون في الأعوام السابقة. خلال كل ذلك ما تزال الدبلوماسية مهنة إنسانية جدا. التعامل مع الزعماء والإرضاء غرورهم، التفاؤل وجها لوجه، المسارعة عن وقوع الكوارث الطبيعية، لقاء الجنود المصابين في المعارك. في الحلقة الماضية من البرنامج تحدثنا عن الدروس المستفادة من مسيرة بيل بيرنز المخنية، وفي هذه الحلقة نتحدث معه عن بعض من اللحظات البارزة وبعض من الشخصيات البارزة التي شهداها على مر 33 عاما كداها في السلك الدبلوماسي. Hello and welcome again to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here in the seminar room of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace with its president, Bill Burns, former Deputy Secretary of State. Bill, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Rob. It's great to be with you.
Bill, Deputy Secretary of State, what is that job? What are the responsibilities? What makes it a unique position in American diplomacy?
Well, the Deputy Secretary of State is the number 2 position after the Secretary of State in the State Department, and so your responsibilities are generally to serve as kind of the alter ego to a Secretary of State. Given the realities of today's diplomacy, Secretaries of State are generally on the road and away from Washington oftentimes a significant majority of their time in office. And so for a Deputy Secretary of State, that means helping to manage the State Department, which is a fairly far-flung organization, something like 70,000 employees, both American and foreign nationals working in our embassies overseas, a budget of over $50 billion when you include our development assistance. And then representing the State Department in senior level meetings in the White House and elsewhere around Washington when a secretary is traveling. Secretaries of State in this age of information technology are always very closely connected to the White House and to the State Department in decision making, but a lot of times I've found as deputy the role you're playing is to try to mind the store when a secretary is traveling abroad.
Now, you did though have at least one experience at a bit of clandestine diplomacy, probably more than one, as Deputy Secretary. So you got out and about.
I did. Yeah, no, I spent a fair amount of my time, again, trying to build it around a Secretary of State schedule, but traveling overseas. And, spent a lot of time on some particular issues, on what were then quiet talks with the Iranians over the nuclear issue in 2013 in particular, and some earlier episodes in the course of my career. So, that's what I enjoyed most about diplomacy, was actually being a diplomat and, trying to do the best you could to promote through diplomatic means, through means short of war, important American interests.
You've witnessed all sorts of Secretaries of State. Mm-hmm. What makes a great one? Not just a good one and a fine one, but a great one?
Oh, I think it's, I've enjoyed, I worked for 10 Secretaries of State, some of them a lot more closely than others, but enjoyed and admired all of them. I think all of them brought some very strong leadership qualities to the job. I think oftentimes what makes for a great Secretary of State, like a great president, is the intersection of those qualities, which all the secretaries I worked for had, and a moment in international affairs. the end of the Cold War, for example, when I worked for Secretary Baker in the State Department. I was the deputy head of the policy planning staff in the State Department. That was a moment of enormous and historic change around the world. The end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, Desert Storm, the Madrid Peace Conference, the reunification of Germany. I mean, history seemed like it was moving literally almost every week. And so the intersection of a very strong, I think, foreign policy team in President George H.W. Bush, Jim Baker as the Secretary of State, Brent Scowcroft as the National Security Advisor, Colin Powell as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The intersection of that group of people, and in particular Secretary of State Baker, and that moment in international affairs, that's the kind of thing that allows secretaries of state to make a really important mark on history.
And when you look back on the 10 that you've worked with, who do you think is underrated? Who history, 50 years from now, will look back and say, you know what, they deserve more credit?
I don't know. I've learned over the years not to compare my former bosses. And as I said, I genuinely enjoyed and admired all of them. And many of them taught me an awful lot. I mean, I worked for Colin Powell, for example, 2 different times when he was National Security Advisor, and I was working in the National Security Council staff in the late 1980s, and then again when he was Secretary of State. And he's as fine a leader as I've seen, not just as Secretary of State, but in any other role. So, but as I said, I don't compare former bosses. I learned a lot from all of them.
This is why you got to be Deputy Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Over the course of your career, one recommendation that you say to yourself, you know what, it's the if only recommendation. If only they'd listened to me about X, things would have turned out a little differently.
Oh gosh, I mean, all of us, I think if you have even a trace of humility, we'll see lots of episodes like that. I think many of us, when I ran the Near East Bureau in the run-up to the Second Gulf War in 2003, and I was surrounded by some terrific colleagues in the Near East Bureau in those years. Ryan Crocker worked with me, David Satterfield, Jim LaRocco, 3 of whom very experienced and had served as ambassadors in the Arab world. And I think all of us, had real concerns about the way in which we were approaching the run-up to the war in Iraq. And we tried as best we could within our professional responsibilities to be honest about those concerns. But certainly I wish we had found ways to be more effective. I wish we had been more outspoken, because I think that war turned out to be a mistake and with significant consequences for American interests and for the interests of people in the region. That's not in any way to suggest that somehow, Iraq would be better off with Saddam Hussein. I don't believe that at all. He was a ruthless tyrant. But the way in which the assumptions that underpinned our approach to that war turned out to be pretty seriously mistaken, and I wish we had been more effective in trying to underscore some of those concerns in the run-up to the war.
What was your best day as a diplomat? A day that at the end of which you said, "Boy, I had a real diplomatic success. This was a great day for America, and I was proud to be part of it." What was your best day?
I mean, I had, with all the frustrations, I was lucky. I had a number of those days. I remember sitting in the room with Secretary Baker and President Bush as a small player in that drama when the Madrid Peace Conference was convened in 1991. And, that was an important moment because I had watched with admiration as Baker had sort of organized in 9 trips to the region that, important diplomatic breakthrough. And people forget Baker has outside his office in Houston a whole wall of cartoons, almost all of which were sharply critical of the first 8 of his 9 trips to the Middle East before Madrid. And all of them said, oh, the Secretary of State's wasting his time, he's never going to get there. But he was quite determined, quite persistent. He knew, to get back to one of your earlier points, the significance of leverage in diplomacy. And he built quite steadily toward an important diplomatic moment at Madrid. So that was a satisfying moment. I took a fair amount of satisfaction for all the controversy surrounding it in the completion of first the interim nuclear agreement with Iran and then the comprehensive deal with Iran. Not a perfect agreement, either of them, by any measure, but I really do believe the best of the available alternatives for dealing with that extremely complicated issue.
Conversely, darkest day as a diplomat?
The darkest day were moments when my colleagues lost their lives. When I was in charge of the Near East Bureau, one of my colleagues from the Agency for International Development was murdered in Amman. I had known him and his family a little bit from my earlier service there, and that was an awful day. And I remember going to Jordan and coming back to accompany his remains back to the United States. I had a similar experience after the attack in Benghazi, accompanying the remains of my 4 slain colleagues back to the United States. And I remember that was a long plane ride home, and it makes you reflect on the sacrifices that my colleagues in the American Diplomatic Corps make, every day around the world. Not just those who lose their lives who are hurt or injured in terrorist attacks, but those who every day are exposed to risks. And there just is no such thing, especially in this day and age, as a risk-free approach to diplomacy. We can't do our jobs overseas if we're sitting behind embassy walls and waiting for people to come to us. We need to be out and engaging with leaderships and governments and people across societies, whether it's in the Middle East or any place else. And that inevitably carries with it some risk, but that's part of the job of American diplomats. So those were dark moments, but also moments in which I was proud to be an American diplomat.
We'll be back with more with Bill Burns in just a moment. Our guest today is Bill Burns. Bill retired in 2014 as Deputy Secretary of State, only the second career diplomat in American history to serve in that high position. He is currently the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the oldest international affairs think tank in the United States. With his retirement, Bill concluded a remarkable 33-year career in American diplomacy. This career included service as ambassador to Russia and to Jordan, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and Senior Director on the National Security Council for Near East and South Asia Affairs. In fact, there was hardly a major issue of strategic significance in Europe or the Middle East over the last 30 years in which Bill has not played a central role, often as a key policymaker or major problem solver. On top of that, Bill, who I have known from my earliest days in Washington, is universally praised as being that rarest of Washingtonians, a kind, fair, generous, nice guy. Bill received his undergraduate degree from LaSalle University and his master's and doctorate degrees from Oxford University. He and his wife have 2 daughters. Bill, a few moments ago you talked about your experience part at the White House, part at the State Department. The term for that in our system is the interagency. Now, how frustrating, how positive, how helpful is it? How does our system work? Or does it really work? And is the State Department running our foreign policy, or is that being handled somewhere else, like the White House?
Well, one of the things that's changed, again, over the arc of my checkered career in the Foreign Service, going back to the early 1980s, is the number of players from the U.S. government who get engaged in international affairs. Now, a lot of that's very natural. When you think about the importance of business, in terms of the American economy and being able to increase trade and investment overseas, obviously you get more parts of the U.S. government who are going to be engaged overseas in doing that. When I was ambassador in Moscow, 2005 to 2008, we had 24 separate U.S. government agencies represented at that embassy. So the number of State Department employees there, career State Department employees, is a minority on the staff. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity for an ambassador to harness, you know, all of those skill sets in the promotion of American interests. The interagency process in Washington, which includes all of those agencies and more, can be a very complicated phenomenon, I think, sometimes. There has been a tendency over several different administrations of both parties to over-centralize decision-making and staffing in the White House, I think, and that gets complicated sometimes too, mostly I think in the implementation or execution of policy, because what you need to do is be able to make, you know, a number of agencies, whether it's the State Department or the Pentagon or others, to feel so much part of the process on the takeoff that, you know, they feel a sense of responsibility for the landing, for how policy is implemented and executed. And so the interagency process is an imperfect one in Washington. A lot of it depends on, you know, the collegiality of people sitting around that table. And, you know, I've been lucky over the years. I mean, even with the most difficult of issues, we've managed to, you know, sort through problems and, you know, come up with sensible recommendations for policy.
So in your experience dealing with foreign counterparts from around the world, what countries, without having to be to pick on just one, which ones have their own most effective diplomatic corps, really truly professionals?
Yeah. Well, I've been lucky. I've worked with some really fine professionals around the world, and sometimes not in major power countries as well. You know, I've worked with a number of diplomats from Singapore, for example, which is a relatively small country, relatively small diplomatic corps, but who are first rate in their ability to navigate overseas. But, you know, I've generally been very fortunate in the quality of foreign diplomats with whom I've worked. You know, their willingness to invest in foreign languages, sometimes putting the American diplomatic service to shame, the amount of time that they invest in particular parts of the world to understand, you know, what makes those societies tick. Now, I've learned a lot from, you know, foreign diplomatic colleagues over the years.
Now, when you left, you wrote observations and suggestions for other diplomats. How about suggestions for your superiors? Dear Mr. President, what would you say to him based on your experience from 33 years?
Oh yeah, well, I don't mean to be presumptuous, you know, and offer, you know, those kind of suggestions. I think, you know, a lot of presidents sometimes look at the State Department. I mean, John F. Kennedy had a famous quote where he called it a bowl of jelly, I think, which wasn't a term of endearment. I mean, I don't think he meant it as a compliment to the State Department, but I think he, like some other presidents, found it frustrating sometimes to get the kind of sharp, action-oriented policy recommendations and then implementation of policy that he was looking for. And so, you know, I think for presidents to understand, as I think all presidents do over the course of their time in office, the value that professional American diplomats can add to what they're trying to achieve for the country. To understand that, you know, being steeped in an understanding of foreign societies and foreign countries is a big asset for the United States. And that I think they find over time, if they didn't understand it at the outset, that the U.S. Foreign Service is a very loyal institution as well. That hopefully that loyalty will mean that they will speak truth to power sometimes, but they're disciplined and they'll execute policy effectively, and that they're worth paying attention to in terms of the perspectives that they can offer. They can help a president navigate some really complicated and fast-changing international issues. It's a long-winded answer, but I mean, I think those are the kinds of that's a framework, at least, for an incoming president to think about that range of challenges before us.
And just lastly, now that you've made the transition from diplomat to president of a think tank, you must have a sense that these sorts of institutions can play a role.
I do. I mean, I think, you know, governments, in my experience, sometimes become victims of their own inboxes. And so, you know, you're driven, sometimes it seems like 24 hours a day, by putting out one fire or one crisis after another. It's rare that you have the opportunity, and it's rare sometimes that you find the skill sets in the U.S. government to look over the horizon a little bit, to develop a kind of framework for thinking about issues, to connect the dots between different sorts of challenges overseas. And I think that's a role that institutions like Carnegie or other U.S. or global think tanks can play a role. Carnegie is a global think tank in the sense that we have centers not just in Washington, but in Beijing and Moscow and Beirut, in Brussels, and we're opening a new one in New Delhi in the spring of 2016. So what we try to do is not see the world just through the prism of Washington, but try as best we can at least to provide a global perspective on lots of different issues. And I think that can also be a service if we do it right.
Bill Burns, I'm sure, based on your experience, you're going to do it right. So thank you very much for joining us
Rob.
on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you very much.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول فعالية الدبلوماسية الأمريكية في بلدكم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.